The original food pyramid was not designed based on nutrition science. It was created out of necessity. Sweden was facing a food price crisis, and families needed a way to eat affordably. That was 1974. Somehow that became America's and the world's official nutrition advice for the next 50 years. Hello, health champions. Today we're going to analyze the new upside down food pyramid and compare it to the old one to see what's changed. So why would they turn a pyramid upside down? Because a pyramid needs a broad foundation. That's what gives it stability. That's the idea of a foundation. But instead, they turned it upside down, so they have the broad side up here and the pointy side down here. If you want to read the details, you can go and learn at realfood.gov. It's free, it's a PDF, you can search for it anywhere online. But they did this on purpose because the first line that you're going to read in this document is that this is the most significant reset of federal nutrition policy in our nation's history. That's a bold statement, but it's absolutely true. And it's not just this nation, it's the biggest reset ever for any nation. So in order to understand how the world ended up with the recommendations that are prevalent today before this new upside down pyramid, we have to look a little bit at the history. And I'm not proud to say, being Swedish, that this all started in Sweden in 1970 because of high food prices. People were protesting in the streets, and the country had to figure out, how do we feed the population? So they came up with different groups of food. They called one basic, and this were foods that were cheap, filling, and essential. And these were examples were bread, rice, potatoes, and the most common recommended fat was margarine. Then they had some supplementary foods. And these were foods that were more nutrient dense. They were high in nutrients, but also high in cost. And these were things like meat, fish, butter, and vegetables. And I put butter here to contrast to the margarine, just to illustrate that for 50 years, pretty much, we've been recommended to eat margarine over butter. But this started because of the high cost of food. And then they figured, they started out with a circle. It was kind of like a pizza with slices. And then this was confusing because there was no clear hierarchy to the foods. People didn't know which ones do we eat more of, etc. So they changed the circle into a pyramid, and this was finalized in 1974. And that one looked very much like the pyramid that we've had for the last 50 years. But the main thing to understand about this pyramid is that it was invented to solve the problem of affordability of foods. It was not based on what was healthy or what was scientifically supported in any way. But within a few years, the United States and most other countries in the world had followed suit, and they adopted this Swedish food pyramid. And then for the next 50 years, they've been trying to match the science to the pyramid. And there's basically been a reverse engineering justification going on to try to create that match. And then if we look at what's going on today around the world, the types of foods that people are being recommended to eat by their government agencies, in most countries, by far, it is mostly grain-based, and with meat being a rare recommendation or even considered optional. And just to mention a couple of interesting examples, if we look at Italy and the Mediterranean area, they recommend more olive oil over animal fats. And that's, of course, because they have a long tradition of producing olive oil, which is not a bad idea. It's also a healthy fat. And they also recommend and include a lot of vegetable, especially local and seasonal vegetables. They have a long tradition of that. And when I researched this, one example that popped up that caught me by surprise was Brazil, because they are the only country that is radically different from the other countries today. And it's because they don't focus on specific foods. They focus on the levels of food processing. So they talk about real food versus ultra processed foods. And they have a hierarchy, and they basically tell you to eat more unprocessed, more real food. And to me, that's very interesting, because that's basically what I have been talking about for many, many years on this channel. And I didn't know that was something that Brazil was trying to do. That the single biggest thing that you can do is just to eat real food and eliminate the ultra processed. And many nutrition researchers around the world consider the Brazilian approach to be the most scientifically sound. So there's been 10 different versions of these guidelines, of these dietary guidelines, since the food pyramid was introduced. So the first guidelines came shortly after in 1980, and every 5 years they've had a new version. They've spent a lot of time and a lot of money, and a lot of people have been involved with this. But the first one in 1980 said, eat more carbohydrates and less fat. Basically 8 to 11 servings or 6 to 11 servings of grain and avoid fat. That's been the theme. Then in 1985, they said, eat more carbs and less fat. And then in 1990, they said the same thing, and you get the idea. And then last year, they said for the first time, anything different, anything at all that was different. And now they say to decrease carbs and to increase healthy fat and protein. There's never been a hint of going that direction on any of the previous guidelines. And now this is basically what turned everything upside down. And it was about time. Why did it have to change? Because more than 75% of adults in the United States have a chronic disease, have one or more chronic diseases. And I want to point out that 75% includes everyone over 18 years of age. Usually when we hear chronic disease, we think about elderly people, retired people, people in wheelchairs, etc. This is 18 years old and up, 75%. And if we look at young adults from 18 to 34, 60% of those people already have a chronic disease. The majority of people under 35, between 18 and 35, have a chronic disease already. And if we look at the kids from 12 to 17 years old, 1 in 3 people are already pre-diabetic, meaning that their A1C is over 5.7. And during the time that we have been recommended these guidelines, we have had obesity go from 15% in 1980 to 42% in 2025. And last year in the United States, we had what they call health care spending, what I call sick care spending, of $5.7 trillion, which is something like $16,000 per person, not per family, per person, and that includes babies and kids and adults and elderly. And when they look closer, they realize that most of those $5.7 trillion are spent on treating directly and indirectly chronic disease. And for the first time ever now, the USDA, and in these guidelines, if you go read your copy, they specifically state that the standard American diet is the cause of this chronic disease, of the vast majority of chronic disease. And in the guidelines, they're also basically indicting all of the previous versions of the guidelines as creating or contributing to an environment that creates this poor health. So let's compare them side by side to really understand what has changed. And the foundation, which used to be the bottom of the pyramid and now it's the top of the pyramid, would be, in the old version, it was grains, 6 to 11 servings. And in the new one, the foundation is protein and healthy fats. And we'll come back to the fats because that's changed as well. When we talk about what you should eat a lot of, kind of the middle ground of the pyramid, that's fruits and vegetables, and that hasn't changed because they still realize that that was a good idea. What I have been talking about lately is that the reason you want to eat fruits and vegetables is for your gut biome, and that message has not gotten out yet. And the opposite end of the pyramid, what you want to avoid, the thin portion, would be in the old version, they said avoid fats. Eat as little fat as possible, whereas in the new version, they say eat less grains. And they're still talking about 2 to 4 servings of grains, which I will come back to. But if you look at the different categories, if you look at these outlines in yellow, we see that fats have gone from something you should avoid at all costs to something that now is the foundation, but they emphasize healthy fats. And at the same time, grains have gone from being a foundation to something you should avoid. We have never seen any such radical shifts ever. And when it comes to proteins, the old pyramid talked about 0.8 grams per day, which ends up for the average person 56 grams per day. But they also emphasized that that should be lean meat. So most people went out and started buying skinless chicken breast, which is the driest and most boring form of chicken you can eat. The new guidelines have almost doubled that, 84 to 112 grams per day, but they're also changed the type. So now they're saying all sources, including red meat and eggs, are perfectly fine. Both pyramids, the old and the new, still include dairy, but the old one said it should be low fat or fat-free, whereas the new one recommends full fat as being preferred. And the fat you should use for cooking has gone from being seed oils, the soybean oil, the canola oil, the corn oil, into recommending butter, tallow, and olive oil. So saturated fats and monounsaturated fats. And the biggest difference here is that the seed oils were extremely harshly processed and even toxic as a result, whereas the new ones, the butter, tallow, and olive oil, are minimally processed. They are foods that you can cold process and you can get a high quality, stable fat. And the seed oils that were highly recommended, there was in the old guidelines something like 49 mentions and recommendations of seed oils. It has gone from being completely eliminated. There's not a single mention of seed oils in the new guidelines, whereas they talk about animal fats and olive oil. When it comes to sugar, the old guidelines recommended up to 10% of calories, which based on 2,000 calories would be 50 grams a day of added sugar, which is quite a bit. If you eat 3,000 calories, that would be 75 grams of sugar. That's a pretty significant handful. The new guidelines say that there is no amount of sugar that needs to be in a healthy diet. And they say if you eat it, no meal should ever have more than 10 grams per meal. And also one of the most interesting omissions in the history of the food pyramid is that processed food was never mentioned, never discussed as something that you should avoid. So as a result, people saw that food pyramid and the foundation were grains, but there was a lot of toast, there was a lot of crackers and biscuits and noodles in the base of that pyramid, which contributed to people eating more processed foods. And the new guidelines go to great length to tell people to explicitly avoid processed foods as being one of the biggest things that you need to change. And of course, saturated fat was the number one enemy along with cholesterol in the old guidelines. And in the new guidelines, saturated fat is okay. And I'll come back because there's a little glitch there, but they do recommend animal fats as one of the big pillars, one of the parts of the foundation. And low carbohydrate diets were never ever mentioned, even though we all know that carbohydrates trigger blood sugar, chronically high blood sugar contributes to diabetes and most of the chronic disease. It was never mentioned as an option that you could use a low-carb diet. In the new guidelines, they don't recommend it across the board, but they say that you should think about it, you should consider it and talk to your doctor about it if you have a chronic disease. Plus, of course, the new guidelines with emphasizing protein and healthy fats are automatically going to cut back on the carbs by at least half. So these are the main changes when we compare them side by side, and you can see how radical these changes are. But then I want to talk a little bit about what could be better. What do they need to think about for future guidelines? And I want to mention something that has never ever really been discussed, and that's what I talk a lot about, which is individuality. Who are these guidelines for? And we need to understand the difference between a person who is in maintenance and someone who is trying to reverse a condition. So the first part is maintenance, and that is for someone who is metabolically healthy. They're not significantly overweight, they're insulin sensitive, and they don't have any chronic disease. So right off the bat, this is less than 25% of the population. And for those people, I think the guidelines work very, very well. In fact, they're probably near perfect. And then if we look at reversal, however, we need to understand this is where most people are. The vast majority of people are in this group, and that's people who are overweight, insulin resistance, or who have some other chronic disease. And now these guidelines are not quite strict enough, and you may need to be a little bit stricter. But this is something, this division, this individuality is something that's never been discussed, and I don't think it can really be covered by any single government document. And this is why it's so important that we study health, we don't take it for granted, and we understand how these things affect our own bodies. So here's the little glitch that I mentioned, because for some reason that I don't understand is they capped saturated fat at 10%, and yet they recommended that the foundation should be animal fats and other healthy fats and protein. So 10% at 2,000 calories, that's only 22 grams of saturated fat. And first of all, saturated fat is not the problem. That's an old leftover. It's a myth that we've started based on saturated fat and cholesterol and a misguided idea of how heart disease develops. But the new recommendations, if you actually follow them, then you will end up eating more than 10%. And in fact, you'll probably be eating somewhere between 30 and 60 grams of saturated fat per day, which again, it's not a problem, and it may even be ideal for most people. Now, I think it's perfectly okay to eat a lot of saturated fats and animal fats. I also think it's a good idea to incorporate a good amount of olive oil, especially for people who tend to have their LDL cholesterol run very high. For some of those people, they could dramatically lower their particle counts by eating maybe half saturated fat and half olive oil, which is pretty close to what I'm trying to do. But nevertheless, if you look at this, they're recommending something that is going to put you over the 10%. So this is a very inconsistent recommendation. And I don't know why they did it that way. Maybe they were just in a hurry. Maybe they couldn't think of everything. But it's definitely something that they need to correct for future guidelines. And I think it's great that they virtually nearly doubled the recommended protein intake. So the old guideline recommended 0.8 grams per kilogram, which ends up at about 56 grams per day for a 150-pound person with 2,000 calories. However, the new guidelines step that up to 1.2 to 1.6, which puts you at 84 to 112. And that's a great step in the right direction. However, If you are trying to heal your body, if you're trying to reverse a chronic disease, if you're trying to burn fat and replace it with muscle, or if you are elderly, if you're a little bit older, like 50 or 60 or above, your muscles tend to degenerate and you tend to absorb protein less efficiently. So for these people, these two groups, you probably want to consider going up a little bit more still. So somewhere between 1.6 and 2.2, which a 150-pound person would end up at 109 to 150 grams. But if you're a larger person, if you have some muscles, if you're taller and heavier at 200 pounds, you might need as much as 146 to 200 grams. And then let's also talk about grains, because they took that recommendation down from 6 to 11 with the old pyramid to the current pyramid, which is 2 to 4 servings. And they say those should be whole grains. And that's great. But whole grains, what is that? And do most people really know? So I'm going to just point out a few things. They're not all equal. But the biggest difference with grains from one type to another is that modern wheat is a completely different beast. It is hybridized, meaning it's been genetically changed, not modified at the genetic level, but it's been recombined forever and ever, hundreds of times, until they have changed properties to get them what they wanted. And what they were going for was high yields, resistance to rain and wind, and fluffy bread. That's basically what they were looking for. But in doing that, they changed the gluten structure of the wheat so that this is where a lot of people now are sensitive to gluten, because it increased the sensitivities, and when people have sensitivities and reactions, that increases inflammation. And before they started hybridizing, they had different ancient grains and even some wheat grains, and they're much better tolerated. They were actually higher in protein and even in gluten, but it was a different kind that didn't irritate humans so much. And some examples were einkorn, emmer, and spelt. So those are things with gluten that you can still bake bread, but it's not going to be this white fluffy thing that you're used to. Then there's some other ancient grains, a lot of which you've heard of, like rye, oats, millet, sorghum, teff, and barley. Those are all ancient grains. Most of them have some gluten in them, but again, it's an older version of gluten before they started hybridizing, so it's much better tolerated. Oats is something that is gluten-free by nature, but when they process it, they often process it on the same equipment as wheat, as modern wheat. So if you have an extreme sensitivity to gluten, then you can't buy standard oats. You need to buy something that's certified gluten-free. And I just want to point out something that most people don't realize. When you go to the store and you buy rye bread, then it is mostly wheat. True rye bread is very, very dense. It's basically a brick. You could hurt somebody with it. It almost sinks in water, even in the plastic bag. The fluffy stuff that you buy in the store, that's basically wheat with a sprinkle of rye. And it changes the color a little bit, changes the flavor, but you are still eating wheat bread. And if you check the labels of ingredients, if the first ingredient is wheat, that's what you're eating. And why does this fluffiness matter? Because when it's fluffy, there's a lot of air in it, so it's a larger surface area that as soon as you put it in your body, it's going to break down faster. It's going to be absorbed faster, and it's going to turn into glucose faster, so you get more blood sugar spikes. So you're always going to be better off with non-milled grain, the grain where you can still see the whole kernel. And some examples would be heavy pumpernickel, like a lot of stores still have this German bread, which basically is shaped like a brick, and it's very heavy. And another example would be steel-cut oats. Other examples where you can still see the whole grain would be cooked millet and wild rice. You could do brown rice as well, but again, the less processed, the better. So in the guidelines, they recommend 2 to 4 servings of grain. And again, I think when they say whole grain, they really need to emphasize what I just talked about, that as much as possible, we're talking about ancient grains and whole grain, the whole kernel. And the thing is, grains are still going to spike blood sugar. So if you're healthy, if you're metabolically healthy, if you're just maintaining, you could easily tolerate and do perfectly fine with 2 to 4 servings, unless, of course, you're allergic or severely allergic to a specific grain or still allergic to gluten, even though it's ancient. However, if you are trying to reverse a condition, now 2 to 4 servings is still too much, and you're much better off if you go 0 to 2. And now you're going to be on the lower end of a low-carb, high-fat diet. So I want you to keep in mind that most of the videos that I do, I talk about low carb. But the reason is that the vast majority of the US population and even the world's population today is in the category where you're trying to reverse a condition, or you should try to reverse a condition. Also worth noted in the guidelines is that for the first time ever, they have actually addressed vegans. And instead of just proclaiming it as this romantic notion that everyone should be vegans and vegetables are sacred, they have actually listed the gaps that to help people understand that if you eat vegan, you have some challenges. And vitamin A, D, E, the fat-soluble, B6 and B12 especially, but also a lot of other B vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids, absorbable, usable forms of iron, zinc, and calcium, and there's many, many others, but at least they've started listing these to help people understand that that may not be the best idea. I understand if people want to do it from a philosophical standpoint, but you need to understand that it's not healthier necessarily, that you are exposing yourself to some nutritional gaps. For the first time ever, low carb, high fat is acknowledged and even recommended if you have a chronic disease such as insulin resistance. For the first time, ultra processed food is being named and called out. And like I said, this is the biggest reset in nutrition policy in the history of the country. And like I've pointed out, we still need to understand a little bit more, and we need to understand and apply individual variations like sensitivities and allergies and where we are on the metabolic spectrum. But at least for the first time in 50 years, for the first time as long as they made recommendations, at least we have the foundation going in the right direction at the government level. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.